Hello, everybody. Welcome to the 2023 Hot Topics in Environmental Law Summer Lecture Series. I'm Jenny Rechtelo, Dean of the Vermont School for the Environment, as well as Interim Graduate School Dean and Director of our Environmental Law Center, Faculty Director. We're very pleased to welcome you here to the presentation today. Each of these talks is worth 1 Vermont CLE credit. And to receive that credit, you just need to keep track for your own reporting records. We'll have time for Q&A after the presentation today. For those of you who are watching on our YouTube page or on Facebook, you can enter your questions in the chat or the comment space on those sites, and we'll get to as many questions as we can. Today, we are very pleased to welcome Grace Van Deelen. Grace is a journalist who writes about climate, agriculture, and science. She's currently a reporter at the new Lede and a fellow at Sierra Magazine, and has also published work for Inside Climate News, Scientific American, Audubon, and Environmental Health News, among other publications. She's particularly interested in stories that illuminate the relationship between scientific research, human culture, food systems, and animal well-being, and sentience. Grace joins us this summer as one of our Animal Law Media Fellows, and today she'll present a talk titled Compassionate Conservation, Bridging the Divide Between Caring for Ecosystems and Caring for Animals. Please join me in welcoming Grace Van Deelen.
Thank you so much, Jenny. Just give me a second so I can share my screen. Okay, does that look good, Jenny?
Looks good.
Okay, perfect. So yes, as Jenny said, I am a science and environmental journalist. I currently work at a publication called The New Lede, and I'm also an editorial fellow for Sierra Magazine. And I write about agriculture, energy, climate, and wildlife, but usually with some sort of science lens or focus, as I was trained as a science journalist. I have been interested in covering animal issues since starting my career as a journalist, and within that I've mostly covered the dairy industry and particularly the environmental impacts of dairy sustainability practices. And then I've also done some writing about how animals are treated within scientific research, which is the topic that ultimately got me interested in thinking about animal well-being and sentience. So I want to preface this talk by saying that I am not a lawyer and not a law student, so there will be limited legal perspective. And then I'm also a journalist. So, you know, I'm approaching this as somebody who just wants to learn as much as I can about this topic, but I don't, you know, have all of the answers. I'm just kind of hoping that this talk will provoke some thought, and I think it's fascinating, and I hope you do too, because it has everything to do with how we care for animals and how we care for the environment. So before we really get into it, I just wanted to start with a quick story. So I used to be a researcher, and I studied both honeybees and native bees at a lab at the University of Wisconsin. And so later we're going to go into more of like native versus non-native animals, but for now I just want to point out that honeybees are basically livestock. So they are not native to North America. They're a domesticated animal that's raised for profit, either for their pollination services or for honey. And so in that way, they're very different from the other bees that live all over, that live in like holes in the ground or sticks or trees that are native to North America. So in this job, I was working with both of these types of bees, and both of these projects required killing bees for the purposes of like figuring out what they were eating and figuring out how healthy they were. So I don't really want to go too far into whether or not insects are sentient or feel pain, except to say that, you know, I've seen enough research to believe that they might. But what I really want to highlight is just how we killed these bees differently. So in order to kill the honeybees, we scooped them up in like a glass jar, and we put that jar into a cooler filled with ice where these bees would like slowly freeze to death over the course of hours. And then on the other hand, when we were killing the native bees, we killed them with what's called a kill jar. So that's what you're seeing on the right there, which is basically a contraption that has a little bit of cyanide at the bottom covered with plaster. And then as soon as the insect goes into the jar, it's immediately euthanized. So I asked the lead scientist on this project why we killed these animals differently, and she responded that basically the cyanide jar is more humane. And I thought that that was really interesting because it signaled that it was more important to treat these native bees humanely than to treat the honeybees humanely. And that was sort of a formative moment for me that ultimately led me to journalism. But of course, as students who study this, you all know that we treat pets differently than wild animals, and we treat wild animals differently than livestock. And I learned in my class this past weekend that they're even classified differently under animal protection laws. And so this talk generally deals with a subset of that conundrum. So what I'm going to be talking about is an instance where we're treating animals differently based on their context. So this talk is about cases where two schools of thought that are both working to protect animals, conservation biology on one hand and animal advocacy on the other, sometimes don't agree as to exactly what that means or what the best way forward to do that is. And so the reason I'm talking about this now is that I'm working on a piece about this for Sierra Magazine, so it's just been at the top of my mind lately. But in order to first start to understand this conundrum, I think we have to go back to 1985, which is when a scientist named Michael Soule, who's pictured here, first published a paper called "What is Conservation Biology?" And so in this paper, he essentially founds the field of conservation biology by laying out some of the main principles. So there's a lot in this paper, and I encourage you to read it, but I'm going to just highlight what I think are the most important parts, which is first the definition. So conservation biology is meant to provide principles and tools for preserving biological diversity. And then he also sets out what he calls normative postulates in this paper for the discipline, including that diversity of organisms is good, the untimely extinction of populations and species is bad, ecological complexity is good, biotic diversity and species have intrinsic value, and evolution is good. So great, right? We want to protect diversity, we want to protect species, but his foundational argument in this paper is that sometimes ecosystems and species matter at the expense of individuals. And he even says that outright in the paper. So he writes, "It may seem logical to extend the aversion of anthropogenic extinction of populations to the suffering and untimely deaths of individuals because populations are composed of individuals. I do not believe this step is necessary or desirable for conservation biology. Although disease and suffering in animals are unpleasant and perhaps regrettable, biologists recognize that conservation is engaged in the protection of the integrity and continuity of natural processes, not the welfare of individuals." So what he's saying here is that the processes of nature that end up with us having species, collectives of individuals, are sometimes more important than those individuals themselves. And then there's another sentence in this paper that where he says that conservation biologists sometimes have to overcome their emotional identification with individual victims in order to carry out their science. So we have two very different sets of values here that both help us protect animals, but we also have sort of a problem of scale. So on the one hand, conservation biology is concerned with conserving species, which is sort of an abstract concept, right? Species are made up of individual animals. And then on the other hand, animal advocacy is concerned with the welfare of individual animals. So I do want to say that there are a lot of cases where it's possible to do both of these things at once. It's absolutely possible to protect the health of a species and the health of the individuals in that species, but there are also some cases where upholding the values of one of these systems of thought makes it sort of impossible to uphold the values of the other. And so one of my favorite science writers explained this as a case where the good guys disagree. And I think that that is a correct characterization, and also kind of makes this a really exciting topic to think about, because it means that conservation biology potentially has a lot to learn from animal advocacy, and recognizing where these clashes happen can make science more ethical, in my opinion. So to illustrate thinking through this, here's just a fun quote that I wanted to include from a retired biologist. So this is quoted in a research paper. He says, "Lacking adequate exposure to the principles of environmental ethics, most practitioners of conservation quickly become missiles without guidance systems," which I think is an apt warning. So for now, I'm going to go into 3 cases where these 2 systems of thought have struggled to find common ground. So 2 are within the management of introduced species. And then the other one is an example of killing or manipulating animals for the purpose of doing ecological research. So the first and biggest area where I think animal welfare and conservation biology butt heads is in the management of invasive or non-native species or introduced species. And all of those terms are very loaded, specifically because the term invasive species connotates that these animals are evil or are doing something wrong. And in many cases, that's not true. And I think we need to think deeply about how we refer to species that are in habitats that they're not usually in. But my first example to illustrate that is in the management of feral cats and introduced red foxes in Australia. So feral cats and introduced European red foxes are responsible for the deaths of many birds and ground-dwelling mammals in Australia. So together, these 2 introduced animals are responsible for the extinction of more than 25 species of wildlife in Australia. And the Australian government is actively working to kill large numbers of cats through poison baiting and trapping. And then the Australian government actively encourages landowners in Australia to reduce fox population numbers through poison baiting, shooting foxes, fumigating fox dens, or employing guard dogs that are trained to kill foxes. And the Australian government itself uses and encourages the use of a poison called 1080, which can cause vomiting, anxiety, disorientation, drooling, and seizures in animals that consume this poison, followed by death. So these 2 animals are a major cause of decline for some endangered animals in Australia. As you can see in the top picture, there's a feral cat eating a crimson rosella, which is a bird native to Australia. And then just to drive this home, every day cats alone kill 3.2 million mammals, 1.2 million birds, 1.9 million reptiles, 250,000 frogs, and 3 million invertebrates. And then on the side there, you can see 2 illustrations of ground-dwelling mammals that have already, that feral cats have already caused to go extinct. So the pig-footed bandicoot and the white-footed rabbit rat. So I bring this up to show you that Australia is primarily killing these cats and foxes out of concern for native species. And it's true that cats and foxes are responsible for a lot of death. And in turn, the Australian government and Australian landowners are also responsible for a lot of death. But that's, acceptable, maybe, because cats and foxes aren't native to Australia. But I also want to highlight that in either case, it's not really the individual suffering of these animals that the Australian government is really considering. It's more about making sure that species can stay healthy for perpetuity, and that species remain, not necessarily that any one individual of these native species is healthy or stays alive. So if if the Australian government were to totally prioritize animal welfare over the continuing of these species, that would look a lot different than what the reality is in Australia. So the second example of where management of invasives, clashes is an example that has gone slightly differently. So that's in the management of wild horses in the US. So if you didn't know, there are more than 82,000 wild horses and burros in the US, depending. That number changes depending on like what types of land you count. And they mostly live on land owned by tribes or public land owned by the Bureau of Land Management, and some live on private land as well. So they are the descendants of animals brought over by Europeans hundreds of years ago, and they've since lived mostly free roaming. However, and I also wanted to say that, the program to manage these horses is very expensive. So last year, the BLM spent $138 million on managing these horses. But it's generally accepted by scientists, and also the BLM has acknowledged that these wild horses are contributing to an overgrazing problem in the West. So the main way that the BLM manages these animals is by rounding them up and then putting them up for adoption. However, many stakeholders agree that that current management plan isn't really working for either the horses or the ecosystems. A lot of people are unhappy about how this system is working. So a little bit of history. The BLM management of wild horses was established by the Wild Free Roaming Horses and Burros Act of 1971, which made it illegal to kill or harass wild horses. So that makes them one of two species. The other one is the bald eagle, that is protected from hunting and commercial slaughter under federal law. So they're one of two species that is specifically named as protected. So the law also requires the BLM to maintain a thriving natural ecological balance among wild horse populations, wildlife, livestock, and vegetation, and to protect the range from deterioration associated with overpopulation. And because I'm talking to law students, I wanted to bring up that this law has been challenged in court, most notably in two cases. The first being Klepp versus New Mexico, which established wild horses as wildlife for legal purposes, which I think is really interesting because just the status of wild horses as wildlife or domestic is sort of blurry sometimes. And then the second is the Animal Protection Institute versus Hodel, in which the BLM agreed to a settlement requiring individuals who want to adopt a wild horse to sign an affidavit saying they don't intend to sell that animal for slaughter, which was a big problem right when the BLM started their management program. So I bring this up to say that wild horses have a particular standing in society that other invasive or non-native species don't have. And you're free to have your own opinion about whether that's good or bad, but the fact of the matter is that a lot of people are upset by how this management program is working, and wild horse populations have never reached the management levels that the BLM is shooting for. So some advocacy programs say that the adoption programs are rife with abuse. So for example, a lot of advocacy groups, including a group called the American Wild Horse Campaign, think that we treat wild horses terribly, management methods are cruel, and that horses maybe shouldn't be rounded up, or at least the program should be reformed. But then on the other hand, there are also people who argue that conserving wild horse populations comes at the expense of native plant species and native animal species, and that horses are unjustifiably privileged over other species that live in the West. So what do we do here? The well-being of other animals like sage grouse and antelope is arguably coming at the expense of wild horses. So does that mean that wild horses don't have a right to be on land in the West? And how do we protect other wildlife species in the West while still caring for the individual well-being of wild horses? I don't have the answer, but a lot of people are trying to get to the answer. So these two examples bring up a question too of whether or not it is ethical to kill introduced or invasive or non-native species simply because historically those animals haven't lived on that land. So if an introduced species like a wild horse or a feral cat is threatening the long-term existence of a native species, a lot of conservation biologists would say that killing that animal is justified. But ultimately, a lot of these animals are also appearing outside of their native ranges because of human activity. So either humans brought them there or human-caused climate change and environmental destruction is forcing these animals to move. And so if you haven't read this article by a former VLGS animal law fellow, Marina, you should, but she argues in here, and I think it's a really persuasive argument that maybe it doesn't make sense to vilify invasive or introduced species at all. So my last example of where conservation biology and animal welfare clash is in the actual act of ecological research, like gathering knowledge, rather than its application in management. So a lot of arguably important ecological research has involved killing or manipulating animals, especially insects and invertebrates, although here we're going to talk about birds. So, and that's a whole other conversation. But for example, in 2004, a scientist named Scott Sillett, who is the head of the Smithsonian Migratory Bird Center, published a paper about the mating behavior of black-throated blue warblers in a forest in Woodstock, New Hampshire. So the purpose of this experiment was to determine how mating behavior differs among territorial birds based on the density of neighboring populations. So they were trying to figure out how mating changed if these birds had no neighbors or more neighbors in like the forest next to them. So in order to study this, they removed between 60 and 120 warblers. So the actual number was not reported, by killing them with shotguns. And the results of this study basically showed that the density of warblers in neighboring populations did have an effect on warbler reproduction. So now they knew something else about warblers that scientists didn't know before. And in a later piece of writing, the authors called this research critical to managing and thus conserving natural populations. So they got some backlash for these methods. Some readers wrote in to the journal in which this was published. And so there was one reader that said that the researchers' methods were unjustifiable because they involved destroying the very things that we are desperately trying to preserve. And so the research team posted a response to this backlash in the Journal of the Ecological Society of America that said, lethal methods are sometimes required as part of a sound, scientifically rigorous ecological research. We support such research if it conforms to established ethical standards, such as those of the Ecological Society of America, meets legal requirements, such as the approval of the appropriate institutional animal care and use committee and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, is peer-reviewed, and addresses relevant scientific questions. No scientist relishes killing animals for research. We would have preferred capturing and relocating birds, but this was not possible because adults could not be reliably captured early in the breeding season, because of the difficulty of maintaining insectivorous songbirds in captivity for months at a field site, and because we observed that individuals released even many kilometers from their territories returned to these sites within hours. Consequently, permanently removing birds was the only practical and humane way to reduce population density in our study. So the question here basically is like, is this right? Is it right that the research that they did was critical for conserving warbler populations? Is it right that the university's Animal Care and Use Committee and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service allowed this? And what if this research ultimately led to saving warblers? What if it indirectly leads to saving 600 warblers or 6,000 warblers? Is there ever like a threshold at which these lethal methods are acceptable? So there were other responses to this, most notably two scientists named John Vucetich and Michael Nelson wrote a paper called "What Are 60 Warblers Worth? Killing in the Name of Conservation?" So they tried to tackle all of those questions that I just raised. And so in this paper, they argue that the case of the warblers illustrates three common mistakes that conservation researchers make. So the first mistake is thinking that ethical responsibility can be outsourced. So in Sillett's case, this manifested in the idea that since they checked with the Animal Care and Use Committee and like followed all of the rules, that their methods were ethical. But Nelson and Vucetich say that just because something follows the rules, that doesn't make it ethical, and sometimes ethics requires transcending rule following. The second mistake they write is that that the research team is totally uncritical of the relationship between ecological research and conservation, and that researchers sometimes imply that any new high quality ecological research is automatically justified because it like might have some chance down the road of being valuable for conservation. But instead, Vucetich and Nelson write that the relationship between research and conservation is always uncertain, and that it is the burden of the researchers to articulate how their research might actually reasonably benefit conservation and argue and make the argument that that benefit outweighs the ethical cost of their research, which they say Sillett and his team did not do when they shot the warblers. And the third mistake that the team made, they write, is that they assumed that individual sentient creatures have no value beyond their value to the population. But Nelson and Vucetich argue that there is substantial rationale to show that individual sentient creatures have intrinsic value, and that if researchers understand this, they would have a much harder time trying to justify lethal methods. And so you saw here that Sillett and his team justified using lethal methods because temporarily removing the warblers from the forest would have been basically too hard. So I think this paper is really interesting because it represents a little bit of a change in thinking from that original "What is conservation biology" paper, in that we're starting to see conservation biologists recognize the intrinsic value of the individual as something that matters, perhaps at the expense of some experiments. So Vucetich and Nelson also give two helpful conclusions to scientists who are doing this work. The first is that compliance with animal research regulations, while important, inadequately accommodates the ethical aspects of animal research. Individual ecologists ought to understand themselves what does and does not represent sound and valid arguments for ethical decisions. So they're saying that it's time for conservation biologists to work harder to understand the ethics of their actions and justify the implications of those actions. So since 2007, a number of researchers have built on this paper and this thinking and are trying to bring more ethics into conservation research and land management. And of course, all ideas are built on other ideas, and we all stand on the shoulders of people who came before us. But in my reporting, it seems to me that the origin of compassionate conservation as its own self-contained idea is generally traced back to a paper by a scientist named Arjen Wallach, who is currently a researcher at the Queensland University of Technology in Australia. And so I sort of buried the lead here, unintended, but she is one of the main researchers who has studied the impacts of feral cats and foxes in Australia. So in 2018, she and her colleagues, which included Michael Nelson of the Warblers paper, published this paper called "Summoning Compassion to Address the Challenges of Conservation." And so in this paper, they argue that establishing a commitment to compassion could reorient conservation to more highly value wildlife, to better respect the sentience of animals, and to better value novel ecosystems, so ecosystems that have been influenced by introduced species, and that we can do all of this while still aligning with conservation goals. So they write in this paper that although the urgency of achieving effective outcomes for solving major conservation problems may enhance the appeal of quick and harsh measures, the costs are too high. Continuing to justify moral indifference when causing the suffering of wildlife individuals risks estranging conservation practice from prevailing and appropriate social values. So she's saying that conservation is falling behind, and we need to quickly figure out what our ethics should be. So there's now a Center for Compassionate Conservation at the University of Technology in Sydney, where Wallach also worked as a researcher. So that center defines compassionate conservation as an interdisciplinary field which promotes the treatment of all wildlife with respect, justice, and compassion. And this definition goes on to say that, there are a few principles of compassionate conservation. The first is do no harm. The second is individuals matter. The third is a commitment to inclusivity, and peaceful coexistence is the last one, ultimately with the aim to enable positive human-wildlife interactions. So what does that actually mean in practice? What do we do on the ground if we want to be compassionate conservationists? So for the story I'm writing for Sierra about this topic, I've interviewed compassionate conservationists, but also just conservation ethicists who are working to get conservationists to have more tools to consider the ethical implications of their work. And one of those people is named Christy Ferraro, who is a conservation ethicist and student at the Yale School of the Environment. And I thought her perspective on this was really helpful. She basically told me that the thing she loves about conservation ethics is that it requires scientists to be creative about their work. And I think that is optimistic in a topic that can sometimes feel very, very pessimistic. So she also told me something really interesting about how, it's true that sometimes there aren't solutions to these issues, but there are actually a lot of places within science and within conservation where it's totally possible to be creative and totally possible to find solutions. So her argument is that before scientists and critics get stuck on these really hard cases where there is no solution, we should really be looking for the easy opportunities to incorporate ethical concerns into science, because as she says, there's so much low-hanging fruit. To get hung up on a difficult case is just a distraction. So some of these potentially easy cases or these low-hanging fruit involve identifying another reason for habitat destruction or the decline of a native species that doesn't involve the introduced species. That's not always possible, but sometimes it is. So for example, in the case of wild horses, that might mean putting more restrictions on what land cattle ranchers are allowed to graze their cattle. And a compassionate conservationist would say that agriculture rather than introduced horses are, should be considered the primary culprit for the degradation of ecosystems in the West. That's the same for the case in Australia. The compassionate conservationists there have argued that eliminating space-intensive animal agriculture should be the first step for conserving native species rather than killing in the name of conservation. And along with that, I think also banning other contributors to habitat loss, such as certain building developments, could also be one of those solutions. So another one could be birth control. So in the case of some animals, birth control is a humane way to deal with the impacts of introduced species. So for example, the BLM is already using birth control to help keep populations of wild horses down. And a lot of advocates for wild horses say that the BLM should drastically ramp up their use of birth control before considering capturing more horses or deploying like more intensive capture methods, because birth control is the most humane option. And it's also been floated as an idea to control feral cats worldwide. And then in addition to birth control and eliminating livestock, compassionate conservationists have floated other solutions, such as introducing predators to control introduced species, which kind of removes the obligation of humans to control those introduced species, and then also behavioral training that could potentially reduce the risk of introduced species to native species. And then strengthening research standards could be another way to implement more compassion in conservation as well. So in the case of the warblers, stronger requirements for justifying killing animals might have prevented the death of those 60 warblers. So as I said, from Sillett's explanation, it sounds like more manpower or funding could have allowed the research team to keep these removed warblers alive. So maybe it actually wasn't impossible. It was just a question of figuring out a creative solution. And, if the standards at that university had required them to do that, maybe they would have. So As we start to consider more and more animals, such as even insects, as sentient and deserving of protections, I'm wondering if we might be seeing research standards become more stringent and expand the types of animals that are protected under those standards. And in fact, a few days ago, there was a coalition of entomologists that released a new paper saying that there's enough evidence now to justify new considerations of insect welfare in any research that involves insects. So this paper is called, "Is it time for insect researchers to consider their subjects' welfare?" So in this paper, they say that, there are basically 3 ways to reduce the impact of research on insects, which could be replacing live insects with non-sentient experimental models wherever possible, drastically reducing the number of insects used in each study, and making sure that all insect experiments are done with humane killing methods if killing is necessary. And I wonder if that extends to honeybees as well as native bees. So when all else fails, or when all of these solutions, aren't practical, compassionate conservation might also just mean changing what we value. So at the end of the day, a lot of these conflicts come down to deciding that an ecosystem needs to be preserved as is at the cost of individual animal welfare. And so it's up to scientists and land managers to determine on a case-by-case basis whether that's something that we should continue doing, or whether or not it's okay to allow an ecosystem to change if it means that more individual animals can live happy, healthy lives. And some compassionate conservationists would say that since the idea of a species is really just an abstraction, it's hard to argue that we should value it more than individual welfare. Although a lot of conservation biologists would highly disagree with that. So along those lines, compassionate conservation has received a lot of backlash. And I don't want to end this talk without bringing up that a lot of scientists have concerns about this way of thinking. So here's just a selection of that backlash. So one paper called it science denialism, and said a halt to lethal control of invasive species would lead to increased land degradation, species extinctions, and biotic homogenization. And then another paper from 2019 titled Deconstructing Compassionate Conservation that had 35 scientists signed on, made a lot of arguments against compassionate conservation. So the first argument was that there are real benefits to native species of controlling populations of introduced species. So introduced species cause native species harm, and allowing introduced species to live unchecked can cause suffering anyway. And then they say that methods used by conservation professionals to kill animals will always be more humane than those used by animals to kill each other. Therefore, doing no harm by allowing introduced species to live unchecked results in harm regardless. And then they also argue that the value of ecological communities and ecosystems which introduced species threaten is greater than the sum of their parts, and that we cannot discount the value of protecting ecosystems as they are. They also say compassionate conservation focuses too much on large charismatic mammals, and that compassionate conservationists are a small group of radical thinkers, and their views have not been corroborated by other less radical conservation biologists. So they also say that doing no harm in the case of the Australian cats and foxes would result in a vast number of native Australian fauna suffering and dying daily, and that harm cannot be unavoided given nature's interdependencies. They also say that the Center for Compassionate Conservation is an animal rights group posing as a scientific conservation organization and is therefore unscientific. So where I'm going to leave you here with these thoughts, and again say, since I'm not a scientist or an animal rights advocate or a lawyer, I'm not really sure what the correct answers are, and I don't know if it makes sense for this idea to gain traction, or whether it will lead to total ecological chaos like Hayward et al. Think. But I do think that at least some good can come out of conservation biologists being asked to think more deeply about the ethical implications of their actions. And I'm particularly interested in how animal cruelty laws and regulations that govern wildlife management could also come into play if this idea of compassionate conservation gains more steam. So I'll leave you with this last quote by Ferrero, who said in my interview that as scientists, we all interact with the animals that we study. It's hard not to care about them, including the individual animals. It's just that we've been trained to be good, objective scientists who don't have that infect our science. But I think that's going to change, and I think it's going to change for the good. It's going to make us do better science and do science better. So she's arguing that it's going to make science more ethical, but also could help us understand the animals that we study even better. So thank you so much for listening to my exploration of this topic. And I'm going to try to answer any questions that you all have.
Thank you, Grace. So for our viewers, we have a few minutes for you all to ask some questions. And again, to do that, please enter your questions in the chat or comment space on Facebook or YouTube, wherever you're watching, and we'll get through as many as we can. So Grace, to start us off, we have a question about the bees that you talked about first. Were the honeybees killed by freezing to further the research study, i.e. would exposing them to cyanide poison the study results, or was it simply a lack of care for the honeybees?
Good question. So in this particular study, no, it wouldn't have mattered if we had killed the bees using the cyanide jars. The one thing is that we needed a lot more honeybees than we needed of native bees, because what we were doing with the honeybees just required a lot more honeybees than what we were doing with the native bees. And we had a limited number of cyanide jars. So that might have been part of it as well. But no, it wasn't anything about like the study design.
Okay, thank you. Another question from the audience. Thanks, Grace. In my own education, I've found a pluralistic, compassionate conservation framework compelling. I want to explore Mark Beckoff's work. What other people or sources do you find instructive?
That's a great question. I think whoever's asking this question probably knows more than I do about it, but Mark Beckoff, I've also talked to Eric Lundgren, who has worked with Arian Wallach in Australia. And then Christy was fantastic. There's also a person who works at the Harvard Bioethics Center. I'm not sure if that is the name of it, but her name is Lisa Moses, and she's a trained veterinarian who also has a lot of knowledge about the history of how animals are used in research. And so she's been a fantastic source for me as well. I apologize, I don't have my source list up here, but yes, there are a lot of people doing this work. And as Christy told me in our interview, she thinks that number of people is growing. So hopefully it will be easier and easier to find people to talk to about it.
You pointed to the possible solution of removing livestock from public lands instead of removing wildlife. And I don't know if you're able to speak to the potential legal ramifications of what that would entail, since there are, private rights associated with those livestock in a way that aren't associated with the wildlife. So that might be legally tricky. But I wondered if you knew whether removing the cattle in particular from public lands would also lead to culls, because I'm not sure in terms of land where that livestock would go. So I wondered if there were just any sort of like trickle down effects of focusing on the livestock that you could identify.
Yeah, I think it depends what you mean by removing. And I think, the most humane way to think about it is incentivizing people to adopt a system of agriculture that does not require grazing livestock. I don't mean necessarily like taking all the cows off of the rangelands and figuring out where they should go. And yes, I can't speak to the legal ramifications of that, as I am just not familiar with it. But ideally, this would be more of like a farmer decides that they don't want to do animal agriculture anymore, either because it doesn't make financial sense or they are worried about the ecological effects on the rangelands, or something like that.
Okay. Are there any animal welfare concerns associated with the wildlife birth control solutions that you posed in terms of, I know that with farmed animals, some of the ethical considerations are wanting to make sure that those animals can express their normal behaviors and activities. And so I just wondered whether sterilizing animals in the wild would create any of those kinds of ethical concerns.
Yeah, I think there are definitely very similar ethical concerns with sterilizing animals in the wild. There's also like the ethical concern of the like stress and pain that might be associated with someone riding up to a herd of horses and chasing them and darting them with birth control. And so I think that's sort of a trade-off that people who think about this have to weigh, is like, is that better, or is it better to have thousands more wild horses on the rangelands that need to be captured and put up for adoption? Or, are we going to end up having so many horses that maybe the only thing that makes sense is that we start killing them? And that's definitely not, we're not anywhere near people trying to think about that at all. But it is a concern that if the BLM can't continue to manage them in a way that makes sense, that might be something they'll have to consider. So yeah, I agree with that. I think that there are those ethical implications, and it's sort of about deciding which the lesser of two evils might be.
There's this cultural attachment to horses that there aren't to other species. So in some ways, it's fortunate for those horses as compared to other animals that, would be the subject of these kinds of population controls, that there is that cultural response of, well, we're not going to kill the horses. That's a step too far, which wouldn't be the case with so many other kinds of animals.
Yeah, totally. One of the reasons I included this as an example is that there's a feature in Sierra Magazine this summer about wild horses and about that very idea that they hold such a mythical sort of role in American history and in our minds that probably gives them some sort of privileges. And maybe if it was another introduced species, we wouldn't be treating them similarly.
Okay, a couple more questions from the audience. Thank you for an excellent, very thought-provoking talk. The critique of compassionate conservation seems to be that it's not possible to avoid all harm, so we shouldn't consider harmful impacts at all. Is there more to it?
Yes, I think there's more to it. I think that so there's that as a critique, but I think there are also a lot of scientists who just basically disagree with the idea that we should ever give up this goal of maintaining an ecosystem or a species as is. Like, I think a lot of scientists would tell you that introduced species are bad even if they're not causing harm, because they're threatening the integrity of an ecosystem, or they're threatening some sort of baseline of how that ecosystem should look or used to look. And I think that the response that compassionate conservationists might have to that is that all of these baselines are sort of arbitrary and that the world's ecosystems change all the time. And so it doesn't really make sense for scientists to choose a baseline to try to keep an ecosystem looking like that. And And I think that's a really difficult question, because if you're trying to protect nature, you have to kind of decide what your goals are. And I think, where you draw those lines can really have an impact on the kinds of things like what species you're pushing out, or what species you're not allowing to thrive there.
Raises some interesting parallels with climate change. That I wonder whether they could be weaponized by opponents of climate change policy. Something to think about. Okay, another question. Can you say a bit about the emerging discourses about wild welfare and how those fit into compassionate conservation or don't?
That is something I really want to know more about. I will say I haven't done as much research or reporting on that issue. The only thing I'm really familiar with is this idea of somehow training predators to not kill their prey, which is super, super controversial. And a lot of scientists say that that's unethical because, well, first of all, it's probably highly unlikely that we could figure out how to do that. But even if we could, scientists would tell you that that's highly unethical because you're interfering in the natural behavior of these animals. And I think a lot of people who are smarter than me need to think about whether or not that is something that humans have the duty to do because we can, or shouldn't do because it's not natural. But yeah, that's something I would really like to learn more about.
Another question. Thank you for an excellent presentation. Do you think wildlife agencies might implement compassionate conservation, or do you think it would take legislation for them to implement it? Or for it to be implemented generally, I suppose, is the question.
That I think that's a hard question, and also I'm not sure how to answer it, because I think that while there are more and more scientists thinking about compassionate conservation, I think that actually transferring those ideas into on the ground action is probably a ways off. But if I had to guess, I would say maybe regulation, just or actions by wildlife agencies would maybe be more likely than legislation. But yeah, I'm not sure.
Do you have any sense of whether there's the political appetite for agencies to do it? Because that's always the issue, right? Is if agencies might be able to do it if they want to without legislation, if they can find a way to fit it into their prescribed mission. But if there's not that political appetite, then the only way it would happen is if the legislature tells them to.
Yeah, I don't think that there is much of a political appetite right now. I think wild horses are one of the maybe the only case where there is a political appetite for protecting introduced species. Yeah, I think that that's something that most people who work in wildlife agencies would be really averse to for now.
Sounds right. Okay, well, we will wrap up there so that we have a few minutes for folks to get to their next class. Thank you, Grace, for your presentation, and thank you to everybody who joined us today. Our next talk will take place online on Thursday of this week at noon. Hope to see you there. Thanks.
Thanks so much for having me.